Hi, where are you watching from? Drop your city and country in the comments.
The air inside the concrete blast bunker of atmospheric separation Sector 3 did not possess a trace of normal atmospheric balance. It was an artificially enriched, crisp mixture heavily charged with the sharp, clinical sting of pure, high-purity oxygen and the cold, synthetic smell of fluorocarbon-based vacuum lubricants designed to never react with volatile gas streams. It smelled of deep, mechanical isolation, air that had been sucked from the mountain valleys, stripped of carbon dioxide by massive molecular sieve beds, and compressed through 5 stages of reciprocating pistons until it generated a terrifying kinetic potential. From the double-glazed, armor-plated quartz window of the supervisor station, the active fractionating tower below looked like a monolithic steel obelisk, rising 90 feet into the industrial bay, wrapped in thick blocks of polyurethane insulation that sweated heavy streams of liquid air under a low, subterranean rumble that vibrated through the reinforced flooring. I sat on a low, iron-welded technician's bench near the high-pressure gas chromatograph, my hands, weathered, covered in faint silver scars from liquid nitrogen vapor flashes and completely free of any hydrocarbon oils or skin lotions, resting flat against my knees. For 42 years, my official title within the National Aerospace and Industrial Gas Directorate had been Chief Cryogenic Distillation Arbitrator and Senior High-Pressure Fluid Dynamics Analyst. In the slick corporate-rendered promotional videos of the modern space infrastructure syndicates, my testing lab was viewed as an expensive, obsolete bureaucratic gatekeeper from the liquid propellant forging era. The new private launch infrastructure contractor, Orbit Vanguard Fuel Dynamics, had long since transitioned to using automated laser diode trace gas analyzers, digital acoustic wave sensors, and cloud-based molecular fluid simulations that treated a massive, supercritical oxygen distillation loop at $183 $circ/tech as a simple, predictable stream of blue vector charts running on a tablet terminal. They genuinely believed that delivering 99% pure liquid oxidizer for a multi-million-dollar heavy rocket launch was nothing more than a matter of adjusting a digital flow rate on a screen and letting automated pneumatic actuators handle the valve timing. But digital trace analyzers do not calculate the microscopic migration of ambient hydrocarbon lubricants that occurs inside a massive turbo expander bearing when an automated seal slowly degrades under cyclic fatigue. They don't hear the tiny, ultra-high-frequency metallic ticking sound inside an aluminum heat exchanger that indicates trace acetylene solidifying into explosive microcrystals long before any chemical variance registers on a remote sensor bank. I was the man who knew the precise thermodynamic weight of a subcooled liquid gas stream, the exact acoustic pitch of a stable distillation tray, and exactly how many fractions of a millimeter a high-pressure oxygen control valve could slide before the phenomenon of adiabatic compression would ignite the copper-nickel internal trim, turning the entire steel pipeline into a self-consuming thermal torch. I was not an aerospace investment manager, an infrastructure operations consultant, or a digital dashboard programmer. I was a physical reader of gas density, phase borders, and pressure boundaries who had spent half his life standing next to screaming air separation columns, reading the invisible, explosive structural degradation that the automated telemetry systems were too blind to isolate. My sister's son, Julian, stood near the primary flow control kiosk, his spotless, anti-static white technician's coat carrying the sharp, clinical smell of sterile storage as he verified an operational checklist on his tablet. He was 35, the regional director of payload delivery acceleration for Orbit Vanguard, a man whose entire professional future was built entirely around supply line velocity compression, which in practical terms meant reducing the mandatory 72-hour purification and stabilization period to 25 minutes, forcing production crews to run the high-pressure oxygen pumps past their maximum hydrodynamic cavitation thresholds to load the pad tanks faster, and threatening union master operators with immediate termination if they delayed a commercial satellite launch due to microimpurity alerts. The automated purity certification from our central network is already logged into the Federal Aerospace Launch Ledger. Uncle Arthur, Julian said, his voice holding the rapid, clipped tempo of an executive whose stock options were directly tied to clearing the launch window before the International Satellite Consortium's financial quarter closed. Our digital spectrometers verified the fluid density across 4,000 independent points along the main vacuum jacket. The impurity curve is flatly zero. The system is operating at total efficiency. Honestly, at 81, walking around an active high-pressure oxygen line with a manual copper sampling flask and an old mirror plate just to check for moisture condensation is an unnecessary physical risk. You're slowing down our propellant delivery. He was framing my systematic removal from the aerospace gas management team not as a cold corporate firing, but as a compassionate, protective retirement plan designed to save my aging joints from the freezing gas vaults. This is the precise clinical vocabulary of modern institutional liquidation. You never tell a master cryogenic distiller that his eyes can read the stability of an oxygen bath more accurately than your uncalibrated software. You tell him he is too fragile for the pressure. The digital spectrometers only read the light absorption through the glass window of the main sampling line. "Julian," I said, my voice low, carrying the flat, gravelly resonance of a man who spent 40 years shouting over the deafening scream of 30,000 horsepower centrifugal air compressors. The computer doesn't see the hydrocarbon film settling on the lower distillation trays near the column base. The separation matrix was engineered by the top aerospace propulsion group in Munich. "Arthur," he replied, sliding his tablet into his leather folder with a swift, aggressive motion. "We don't need an old gas fitter using an analog pressure gauge to tell us if the liquid is clean. We are on a 24-hour countdown to initiate the primary propellant transfer for the Aegis 7 Heavy rocket before the global satellite window locks. My investment board and I have already cleared your enrollment at the Highland Vista Sanctuary. It's an exclusive senior village in the high plateau with its own oxygen-enriched climate rooms, private golf paths, and complete isolation from heavy industrial operations." What Julian completely left out of his fast-paced corporate summary was the fact that his advancement to Vice President of Global Launch Logistics was entirely dependent on delivering 300 tons of liquid oxygen to the launch pad before the end of the fiscal month, and that his private partnership had already negotiated to lease the air separation fields back to the state at a 500% premium the moment my regulatory inspection office was dismantled. The mechanical friction between my experience on the floor and my nephew's digital launch timeline reached a dangerous threshold exactly 12 days later, during the production loading of the main propellant conduit 3 oxygen. The component was a massive, 20-inch diameter double-walled, vacuum-insulated line designed to carry liquid oxygen under extreme pressure from the storage sphere straight to the base of the rocket's primary stage tanks. To the Aerospace Operations Office, it was a high-value infrastructure asset that needed to be brought up to full flow volume within 8 hours to avoid a severe non-compliance penalty from the satellite consortium. To Julian, it was the final physical benchmark that needed to be verified before the corporate directors arrived for the public ribbon-cutting ceremony at the launch complex's new automated fueling wing. He came down to the concrete pad of Sector 3 during a heavy, gray Friday afternoon rainstorm, his thin-soled leather shoes getting instantly soaked as he stepped into the cold slurry of gravel and water near the high-pressure valve manifold. He was accompanied by a man named Sterling, the newly appointed Commissioner of Aerospace Infrastructure Compliance, a 34-year-old political operative whose knowledge of fluid mechanics was entirely limited to what he had skimmed from the executive summary of the state industrial development budget. "Mr. Thorne," Sterling said, his face pale as he gripped his umbrella while the cold mountain rain swept across the concrete pad. "We've reviewed the electronic readouts from the conduit's primary vacuum sensors. The internal telemetry shows zero pressure fluctuations along the primary delivery line. We need you to sign the formal thermodynamic clearance certificate so the technicians can pull the manual safety clamps and let the automated pumps ramp up to full capacity." He reached out a leather-bound folder with a digital tablet fixed inside, a legal document that would completely clear Orbit Vanguard of any environmental or structural liability if the high-pressure oxygen caused the material's failure or destroyed the launch pad infrastructure. The digital sensors are reading the gas velocity inside the smooth center of the pipe, Mr. Sterling, I said, keeping my hands buried inside the heavy, clean pockets of my canvas inspector's coat. They aren't reading the static pressure building up behind the secondary oxygen filtration screen. The storm water outside isn't the problem. The internal friction is. Julian stepped directly into the gap between me and the compliance commissioner, his teeth grinding with frustration, his voice cracking as he shouted over the high-pitched, mechanical whine of the massive liquid oxygen turbine pumps. Arthur, let's end this old-timer performance right now. The pipeline software calculates flow friction and structural expansion automatically based on the fluid density. Every hour this valve remains closed costs the syndicate $80,000 in delayed launch window penalties. Your refusal to sign this clearance is a direct breach of your regulatory mandate. If that screen isn't touched by sunset, Sterling and I will initiate an emergency administrative override under the Aerospace Infrastructure Fast Track Act. He stepped closer, his face inches from mine, his eyes wild with a cold, financial desperation that contained no trace of family loyalty. We know what this is about, old man. You're terrified that this entire complex is going to run on automated switches without your signature on a piece of paper. But your era is dead. If you don't clear this line, we will have facility security escort you off the well site for domestic obstruction, and your state pension's premium medical fund will be frozen pending an immediate compliance review. He leaned in until the cold rain from his hard hat dripped onto my collar. The Highland Vista Sanctuary doesn't take residence with an open state investigation, Arthur. You'll be spending your winter in a state-run tenement down by the chemical docks where the tap water smells like sulfur and the floor vibrates every time a waste barge pulls in. Sign the clearance and let the pumps roll. The final confrontation did not take place in the rain of the launch pad. It occurred 48 hours later inside the ultramodern, glass-walled conference suite of the International Aerospace Risk Underwriters Group on the 74th floor of the Continental Tower, a building that looked down onto the city harbor like a concrete fortress. Julian had arranged an emergency technical arbitration hearing, using an unmarked corporate vehicle to transport me there as if I were a piece of non-functional laboratory equipment being brought before a panel of corporate bankruptcy referees. Chairman Geller, the senior risk underwriter whose global fund had guaranteed $400 million against the completion of the Aegis 7 launch grid, sat at the head of the long obsidian table. Next to him sat Julian, his laptop open to a high-fidelity cryogenic fluid simulation titled Project Ignition, propellant flow optimization, and Commissioner Sterling, who was quietly reviewing a stack of pre-signed environmental waivers. Mr. Thorne, Chairman Geller began, his voice low, dry, and entirely devoid of human inflection, the voice of a man who measured the world solely in risk-adjusted capital returns. Your nephew has provided this panel with an exhaustive, data-driven analysis of the Sector 3 distillation curve. The digital metrics indicate that the liquid oxygen purity is entirely stable and capable of handling the maximum flow rate. Your continued refusal to sign off on the thermodynamic clearance appears to be based on personal stubbornness rather than any measurable engineering reality. The monitor on the obsidian wall flashed an animated loop of the launch pad, showing the liquid oxygen flowing smoothly through blue digital channels into the rocket's internal tanks, the interface glowing with a bright, comforting green that indicated zero risk of failure. The simulation is running on an idealized static model, Chairman, I said, standing up from my seat without using the armrests. I didn't reach for a USB drive. Instead, I reached into my clean rigger's bag and placed 3 separate glass jars onto the polished surface of the table. Each jar was filled with a thick, gray liquid that was slowly separating into layers of coarse metallic dust, dark compressor silt, and a strange, translucent yellow film. In September of 1994, I said, my voice cutting through the room's silent air conditioning with the absolute authority of an old master distiller's voice. The sister system of this project, the Launchpad 2 fueling line, attempted to transfer liquid oxygen under identical high-velocity parameters. The company computers at the time stated the internal aluminum heat exchangers were perfectly free of impurities. But the computers didn't calculate what happens when a high-pressure compressor seal leaks micrograms of mineral oil into an air separation stream over a 9-month production cycle. Julian slammed his hand onto the table, the glass cups rattling against the granite trim. The 1994 incident used early mechanical oil-lubricated seals, Arthur. Sector 3 uses an advanced magnetic levitation gas-bearing system that operates completely without hydrocarbons. The bearings operate without hydrocarbons, Julian, I replied, looking directly at Chairman Geller, whose eyes had shifted from the simulation screen down to the translucent yellow film in the glass jars. Your maintenance crew didn't realize that the emergency backup compressor used during the storm last Tuesday morning wasn't a magnetic line. It was an uncertified diesel-driven backup pump. That yellow film in the jar isn't cleaning polymer. It's compressor oil from that backup run, trapped inside the lower distillation trays 3,000 feet down the system. Your automated system is reading the pressure as stable because the high-velocity flow is temporarily blowing past the restriction. It's not a clean oxygen line. It's a 40-ton explosive fuse. I pointed out the window toward the gray outline of the launch complex in the distance. Right now, the flow velocity inside that conduit is creating microstatic charges as the liquid passes the contaminated filtration screen. Because your sensors are calibrated to read gas purity at the center of the line rather than friction-induced heat along the pipe borders, your software thinks the system is balanced. The moment you pull those manual safety clamps to increase the turbine pressure for the final hot load sequence, that high-velocity friction won't just move the fluid. It will initiate an adiabatic compression event against that hydrocarbon film. The resulting detonation won't just rupture a pipe. It will consume the entire 20-story launch structure, destroying the Aegis 7 rocket on its mountings and flattening every building within a 2-mile perimeter. In the mechanics of high-pressure cryogenic gas dynamics, there's an absolute physical boundary known as the adiabatic ignition threshold, the exact limit beyond which the compression of an oxygen-enriched atmosphere will spontaneously detonate any trace hydrocarbon material without needing an external spark. It is a mathematical reality that cannot be negotiated by an executive vote, amended by an aerospace utility commissioner, or hidden behind a corporate spreadsheet. I pulled a small, clean blue ledger from my inside pocket. The original 1994 high-pressure aerospace disaster and propellant safety registry, certified by the Federal Bureau of Aerospace Safety and bearing the permanent restrictive red stamp oxidizer exclusion number 904 North. It was a physical document that existed entirely outside the company's cloud infrastructure, an original regulatory safety mandate that could not be wiped by a system update or bypassed by a state fast-track development waiver. Under Chapter 9 of the Federal Aerospace Safety Code, I said, placing the ledger directly over Julian's laptop keyboard, any high-pressure oxygen separation or transfer system that exhibits evidence of secondary compressor oil infiltration must immediately enter a mandatory technical lockdown. The system must be blown down with pure gaseous nitrogen. The automated turbines are frozen by operation of federal law, and the launch clearance is suspended until a physical solvent wash validation can be performed by a licensed federal inspector. The boardroom became completely silent, save for the faint, high-altitude creak of the glass wall as a fresh wind gust hit the building. Chairman Geller leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the federal red stamp on the canvas cover. He looked up at Sterling, his voice dropping into a razor-thin whisper that signaled the immediate end of his professional patience. Is this safety exclusion active in the Aerospace Regulatory Archive, Commissioner? Geller asked. Did your department approve a launch fast track that violates a federal oxidizer pressure mandate? Sterling's hand shook as he reached for his glasses, his face turning an ashen, translucent white as he tried to navigate a regulatory database on his phone that he didn't know how to search. The digital infrastructure portal doesn't show the pre-2000 Subsurface Material Exclusion Acts. We assumed those restrictions were resolved during the digital data migration sweep of 2012. The physical laws of adiabatic ignition aren't subject to your data migrations, Sterling, I said, taking my manual back from the table. If your operator pulls those manual clamps tonight before the system is purged with nitrogen, the static friction will rupture the conduit before the rocket can ignite its main engines. You won't be putting a satellite into orbit. You'll be reading the obituary of every technician sitting in that launch bunker when the pad detonates. Chairman Geller stood up, his face completely expressionless, but his voice carrying the finality of a court judgment. The insurance clearance for the Orbit Vanguard project is formally revoked, effective immediately. Freeze the loading sequence. Get the propellant crews back on the floor and dump the oxygen tanks before the line undergoes ignition. Julian sat frozen by his chair, his laptop screen reflecting a series of automated warning notifications that his software was finally starting to generate as the localized friction heat along the pipe borders began to register outside normal operational limits. Uncle Arthur, you old lunatic, you've ruined us. The Aerospace Syndicate. They will call the primary manufacturing bonds tomorrow morning. We've already leveraged our entire corporate capital account against the completion timeline. If that certificate is frozen, we're completely bankrupt by Friday. I didn't leverage your capital against a contaminated oxygen stream. Julian, your own arrogance did, I said, packing my glass, sampling jars back into my rigger's bag. You thought that because an old man had frost on his sleeves, his memory was dead and his logbooks were garbage. But an analyst's job is to read the reality of the material, not the profit of the developer. The collapse of Orbit Vanguard fuel dynamics was not a gradual decline. It was a sudden, vertical liquidation that erased the company from the Aerospace Utility Registry within 90 days. The International Satellite Consortium and the National Space Development Board withdrew their $400 million financing agreements within 48 hours of a federal engineering team confirming the extensive hydrocarbon oil film along the Sector 3 distillation trace. The cost of running an emergency gas blowdown, solvent washing the 90-foot fractionating column, and rebuilding the high-pressure filtration blocks exceeded $56 million, a capital expenditure that made the entire rocket infrastructure project completely unprofitable. Without the expected launch completion bonus to clear his secondary credit lines, Julian's partnership filed for Chapter 7 liquidation before the winter snow had reached the mountain launch facilities. His luxury performance vehicle was towed out of a suburban driveway in mid-January, a quiet financial repossession witnessed only by the local snowplow drivers who watched the bank's agents load it onto a flatbed truck in the gray morning slush. Julian called my office line once during the spring thaw, his voice hollow, flat, and completely stripped of his former corporate cadence. He spoke for less than 3 minutes, asking if I could use my standing as a lifetime member of the Aerospace Gas Directorate to help him secure an entry-level position as an assistant cylinder weight checker on the low-priority agricultural fertilizer channels in the Southern Basin. I told him that the fertilizer yards were using automated drone sweeps now, and that the computers had no operational space for an executive who didn't understand how to read the physical pressure of an oxygen line. I was not moved to the Highland Vista Sanctuary. The Aerospace Council quietly canceled my retirement notice the following Monday afternoon. They realized that without my specific physical understanding of cryogenic distillation and the undigitized oxidizer exclusions, they couldn't certify a single propellant facility in the launch division without risking a structural explosion that would void their municipal insurance policy. They created a permanent position for me, Chief Propellant Integrity Arbitrator and High Pressure Systems Custodian for the Aerospace District. My salary is now paid directly out of the nation's core emergency defense infrastructure fund, more than enough to keep my office warm through the winter storms without ever needing to look at a corporate senior community brochure. I still sit on my wooden bench in the analyst's office at the base of the atmospheric separation tower, watching the digital telemetry lines flicker on the automated compressor screens below. The distillation columns operate under my supervision now, their purity metrics cross-checked every morning against my physical copper sampling flasks. And the liquid oxygen leaves the floor at a slow, measured pace its transfer velocity kept strictly below the critical threshold until the high-pressure system has found its perfect, permanent balance within a matrix. The younger generation operates under the dangerous, modern delusion that technology is the same thing as control, and that a three-dimensional animation can force the volatile fluid to ignore the laws of chemistry. They believe that success is a matter of simply accelerating the schedule and erasing the manual safety margins of the past to maximize a quarterly return. But they do not understand that the oxygen does not look at your investment targets, and the pressure does not care about your promotion timeline. Every commercial empire, every aerospace fortune, and every family dynamic is ultimately subject to the physical limits of the material below. My nephew thought he was optimizing a slow asset when he tried to clear away my experience and force me out of the distillation tower. He didn't have the functional capacity to understand that the old, quiet man he viewed as an operational bottleneck was the only structural anchor keeping his entire complex from being incinerated by the weight of the compressed gas. In the end, he wasn't defeated by a family feud or an elaborate legal conspiracy. He was simply broken by the unyielding laws of the adiabatic ignition threshold he refused to believe was real.